Further ado, I'm proud to announce Nicola Nye with Practical Ethics.
Good afternoon, room 8. I thought I would pick a very small, light topic to talk about just to end your day. The theme of this conference is privacy and security. And what underpins our desire for that? Ethics. It's about making sure that you and me and everybody are treated with the respect that we deserve. And the fact that often we are not treated with that respect respect is not automatic, and so we need to build it in and encode it into our privacy and security practices. But we as technologists, we tend to focus on the code first. And we leave those policy decisions about how you handle privacy and security, and we make it somebody else's problem. It's our problem. We're the ones building this technology. We're the ones who understand this technology. We have a responsibility. We're the change makers. We know how our technology can be misused. We're the ones who have the responsibility to do something about it, to act ethically and make sure that the technology that we create acts ethically too. But what does it mean to act ethically? Like, I could see very easily when someone or something was behaving badly, that was obvious. But how did I define what it meant to live an ethical life, a life in line with my values? And that I found was a bit more of a slippery concept to grasp. So I did some research, and because I'm kind and lovely, I'm not going to make you sit through all that research, and I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes. So today I'm going to start about trying to define in an understandable way what even is ethics. If you look at the news, you might be despairing and think ethics is dead. Does it have any place in a very capitalist-driven society? Clearly, this is a rhetorical question. If you look at a little bit further down, it's about finding, that Voldemort does not kill Harry. Sorry if that's a spoiler for anyone, but, by the fact that there's 3 more books, you can tell Harry survives. I don't believe that ethics is dead, and I hope by the end of this talk you will be inspired too. Now, smart people have been considering what it means to be ethical for thousands of years. So I'll give you a bit of a tour about their deep, deep thoughts. But that gets to about 40,000 feet up, and this talk is about practical ethics. So once we know what ethics really look like, then we can dive into the practical of what does it look like for us in the here and now, and give you some tools to build with it. And when we lead, others follow. There's been so many inspiring talks here that I've gone to this week. My brain is very full. Serena spoke to us about how to inform and encourage other people to embed good security practices. And I'm hoping that after today, I will inspire you to do the same thing, to lead good and ethical life values. Now, early last year, I was full of despair. I was pretty depressed. The world seemed to be on an unstoppable path towards doom. Every time I opened any kind of news source, whether it was social media or one of the more reputable sources, I felt my heart break just a little bit more. Donna's keynote yesterday encouraged us to look at the opportunities rather than looking at the problems, and look at a way to improve through appreciative inquiry. I had found something else that spoke more to me, the notion of hope punk. And that says that the very act of hope is itself an act of resistance. When everything seems bleak and terrible, and even your government is telling you that there is no hope, to actually have that hope is a real act of resistance. I hope that we can do better. I think we can do better. I want to share my hope that we can do better with you. Lighting someone else's candle does not diminish your own. All right, so about that doom. Everything is awful. This is fine. Is it any wonder that we despair that the companies that we entrust to look after our data aren't behaving towards us in a respectful and ethical manner? Whether it's data breaches taking place at HR companies or universities, social media being used to encourage us to not just buy products, but even influence the way that we vote, or normalise dehumanising minorities. Our data is being weaponised against us, and we've only just started to realise the extent of how this is happening. And while we are horrified, we feel helpless and powerless to act. And that is the essence of despair, that powerlessness. Sorry for subjecting you to that. So what does the world look like, perhaps in, say, 2021, thanks Donna, if we fixed all of this? I can feel my shoulders dropping. Doesn't that feel much better? Clearly this has been all on our minds. There's been plenty of women talking about topics to do with privacy and ethics throughout this talk. Josh has highlighted this in his Twitter. I think that when it comes down to it, this is what we want. How do we get there? So back to that thing about what ethics even is. Ethics is at its heart the way of behaving and building a world the way it should be. Just, fair, kind, compassionate, full of respect. And not behaving in a sort of aggressive, defensive reaction to the way that life is today. Quite frankly, the world needs more llamacorns building the world as it should be. Right, but that's a bit abstract, isn't it, right? Be nicer, be a llamacorn? What does that mean? So let's look at making it a bit more concrete. Now I said that, it's often easy to find out where an organisation, it's very apparent where an organisation is not being ethical. And by looking at that and inverting it, you can kind of start to get a feel for what it looks like to find an ethical organisation. And I looked at sort of 3 aspects when I'm considering whether an individual, an organisation or a corporate or even a government is behaving in an ethical manner. I looked at the external factors. Is what this entity is producing, is it in itself ethical? Does it contribute anything positive to the moral values of society? Does it respect the people who are using its service? Is the company itself inherently ethical? Does it value and embody ethical behaviour? There's an organisation called Read the Docs, and they have chosen to advertise, but they're using ethical advertising, and they only take on advertisers that are in line with its own model. Is the company internally ethical? Does it treat its staff and its vendors in a respectful manner? Now, it's really easy to think of companies who fit the no case, and it can be a little harder to find the companies that fit the yes case. And that I think is part of why we are in the state that we're in today. Can ethical behaviour even survive in this environment? Pretty easy to feel that ethics has been trampled before capitalism and self-interest. But naturally, the whole point of this talk is to provide an emphatic yes to this rhetorical question. And I want here to give you the tools to become the llamacorns of my ideal future. And sure, I want to believe it's possible because I want to believe it's possible. I want to believe that there is a future in which I want to live in. And that's nice, but that's not really enough to convince people to behave ethically. Do so because Nicola says so. It doesn't even work on my kids. So how do you motivate people to do the right thing? We've got laws, and that motivates people through fear of punishment. But if you've got laws which are slow to enact and very difficult to codify every possible case in law, people go looking for loopholes. They want things to be easier. So while that is a good baseline, and I believe that we need laws in society, relying solely on laws to fix the problems is not going to be enough. We can look at evolution. People think that evolution rewards the most competitive. That one's the one that will survive and go on to flourish. That's not actually the case. Evolution rewards companies who are fit for purpose, not the most competitive. Then you can even appeal to capitalistic base motivations, the rule of commerce. If a company behaves ethically, if a company treats its customers with respect, those customers love you. Ask me how I know. Customers who feel like they've been treated with respect are more likely to stick around. They're more likely to come back and give you repeat business. They are more likely to experience goodwill towards you. So if something goes wrong, they'll be like, that's okay, I'm pretty sure they've got my back. They are more likely to give you the best kind of advertising you can get, which is free word-of-mouth advertising. They go out and they become your brand ambassadors. So if you are looking at ways to, just even look at your bottom line from a purely capitalistic point of view, behaving ethically actually is in your own self-interest. Seems a bit of a kind of weird thing going on there, but it works. Finally, you've got to sit there and say, well, how do you want to act? Don't you believe it's possible? Yes. All right, so what can we actually do? As a consumer, what can we do to ensure that we've got an ecology to allow, evolution to do its thing? We can invest our time and our money and our data wisely, providing you've got the privilege to do that. I've given you a bit of a framework to examine a company and decide whether you think that it's behaving in line with your values. Give them feedback. There was a case recently, just last year, large companies pulled a bunch of sponsorship off a breakfast talk radio show after some misogynistic remarks were made. Your feedback really matters. Companies will sit up and take notice. Particularly, you look at what's happening with Not My Debt. The public band together and got something sorted, and it changed the behaviour of what was going on with the government. Companies are not perfect. People are not perfect. You want to give people a chance to improve. So one of the measures that I also look at is, how does the company respond when they get that feedback? Do they go into straight on full arse covering mode, or do they respond positively and engage with you to find a better path forwards? So that's as a consumer. What can we do as employees? Your company does not have a mind of its own. The company is just a collection of people. You're one of those people. If you happen to work for a small company, great, because your voice as a proportion of the whole is much bigger. You have a better chance to institute change. You can choose where you invest your time and your labour, and I encourage you to choose the companies that are in line with your values. This obviously comes with a warning. Employees have recently been fired for attempting to unionise, showing that corporate activism is actually not without risk, can have very real consequences. And it's okay to pick your battles and pick the time and place and the amount of energy you put into them. So I've done a lot of talking, but I still haven't explained what ethics is. I've talked about what it can and can't look like, and I've made a case that even in a capitalistic society, an ethic company can still be viable, but what is ethics? Now, those of you who have just been over in the arena have been exposed to The Good Place with Karen and Bradley, but the show is just so great that you have to sit through this slide again. Fans of this show will recognise Chidi here, and he's attempting to teach the wayward Eleanor how to be ethical so that she can be worthy of a good afterlife. He had all of eternity, and I've got the span of this talk, so let's do this. Now, earlier I said it was about behaving the way the world should be, but it's complicated. You need freedom to be able to act ethically so that it is actually a choice. Lots of conditions can remove your agency. Poverty, discrimination, misrepresentation, the tyranny of distance. I could go on. Philosophers even have sat down and argued, are people good or evil or neutral at the time they are born? Which gets into a bit of that nature versus nurture thing. Maybe we're just all doomed to failure because we're born evil. Turns out philosophers can't actually agree, and it's very hard to, take a sample size. Dear baby, tell me, are you good or evil? Most parents would say at 2 a.m, they're pretty evil. So the philosophers can't agree on this, but they do agree on one thing, and this is the thing that brings me hope. Our actions reinforce our ethical alignment. The things that you do is what can move you towards good or towards evil. Well, I think that's pretty great, because it doesn't matter where you start or what you've done in your past, you can always improve and do better, and so can everybody else around us. Awesome. Which one of these will you listen to more? I love this show. So, to put it in another way, there's a bit of an old fable. A grandfather is talking to his grandson, and the grandfather says to the son, "Grandson, there are 2 wolves inside you. battling for supremacy. There is a good wolf and there is a bad wolf. And the grandson, terrified, is like, which one's going to win? The grandfather says, well, it is the one that we feed. Please make sure you feed the right one. So is ethical behaviour bad? Wait, what? Bad. I've just spent this entire time so far telling you that ethical behaviour is all about being good, and how can it be bad? It's complicated. So if you look critically at ethical theory, it's not perfect. Our idea of ethics, much like trying to program an AI, codifies our biases. There's racial bias. Currently, the European Caucasian idea of good ethics is acceptable. The Native Americans have had a code of ethics that's existed for thousands of years longer than the Europeans have had it, and yet their idea of what constitutes good behaviour is deemed unacceptable. There is class bias. Guess who had the time to sit there and think all of those deep, thinky thoughts about what it meant philosophically to be a good and ethical person? Rich people with lots of leisure time. That's going to reinforce the economic status quo, because if you're a rich, powerful person with lots of leisure time, you don't want to give that up. This produces a gender bias, because in times past, guess who was rich and powerful with lots of leisure time? It wasn't the women, it was the men. So this tends to codify this into our ethical systems. But all is not lost. These are just challenges. We can overcome them. Diversity matters. We just need more voices in the room thinking and talking about what it means to live an ethical life. Now, as people involved with development communities, you're all familiar with the idea of reusing code or hardware components. So now I'm going to reuse some patterns of thought. And I'm going to give you a quick tour of just 3 codes of ethics that philosophers have been talking about. Virtue ethics. This looks at what motivates you to do the right thing. This is the noble knight. Think about the lone samurai or the paladin in times of old. What they're all about is the character. Are you a good person? Do you have honesty? Are you loyal? Do you have courage? Are you generous? It's all about your character over your actual actions. Someone is allowed to be a good person under virtue ethics and still lie. It's about the unification of self. You can't be a ruthless go-getter in the office and a calm, kind and compassionate person at home. You've got 2 faces. Virtue ethics says it's your character, it's who you are underneath all of that, and that must be consistent. You need to have good judgment. You can't just hand down a set of rules, say 10 of them inscribed on some tablets. But it's all about having an ability to know what the ethical outcome should be and just know how to kind of get there. That makes it very hard to teach virtue ethics because there are no rules. Now, there's a benefit to being someone who lives in a virtue ethics kind of world. They are more likely to receive help from their community. Who do you help more? The person who's full of self-interest, or someone who is generous, loyal, honest, compassionate? They might take some bad actions on occasion, but you feel that at heart they are a good person and you want to help them out. So again, virtue ethics works in your favour even from a sort of self-interest kind of point of view. These people tend to draw out the best in others, much like the unpaid volunteer labour that drives this conference. I would argue that many of them are motivated by virtue ethics. But virtues overdone in either direction, too much or too little, can be bad. Consider courage. Too much courage, you are rash. You jump in where angels fear to tread. No, not enough, and you're a coward. Consider generosity. Too much, and it is wasteful. Not enough, you're stingy. Humility. Are you shy or are you arrogant? So virtue ethics tries to find the middle ground in all of this. But there are some things that even virtue ethics says there's no middle ground. You cannot have a little bit of murder. You can't be a serial killer and go, oh, 1 serial killing, maybe 2's okay, oh, but 10 is totally inappropriate. So even under virtue ethics, there are some things that are just still not okay. So virtue ethics looks at what motivates you to behave well. Utilitarian ethics is all about focusing on the outcomes. The end justifies the means. So you might say, torturing people is wrong. Seems to be a fairly uncomplicated statement on the face of us. But a utilitarian ethics person will sit there and say, I will willingly, or reluctantly potentially, torture one person if it will save the lives of thousands. There is a bad person, they've planted a bomb, I'm not Superman, I can't go out and throw the bomb into the sun, so the only way to find the location of the bomb is to torture this terrible person. Now, a virtue ethicist might sit there and say, that makes me very uncomfortable, I'm not really able to do this. A utilitarian will say, it makes me uncomfortable also, but I am prepared to do it because the end justifies the means. So they're looking at the consequences after you've taken the action. So virtue ethics is looking at what motivates you to begin with. Utilitarian is looking at what the outcome will be from taking your action. But how do you evaluate the outcome? How do you decide it's going to be the best outcome? Is it about generation of beauty, pleasure, happiness, prevention of suffering, creation of wealth? Utilitarian ethics is talking about maximising utility, and this is making things the best for the most people and minimising the amount of harm for the most people. But you have intensity and duration to consider, certainty and extent. I really liked my ice cream today. That was pretty good. That was intense. It was fairly short. I had to go back for a second. So is that better than providing a week of meals for someone else? Like, bread for a week for someone else. They get a meal for a week, but it's very boring, and I get very intense feeling of deliciousness at chocolate ice cream. So which outcome, if you had to choose, you could do one or the other, which one are you going to choose? It's very hard to quantify. And one person's happiness is not the same as the other's. I really liked Wonder Woman. Some people really like Batman, which I couldn't stand. So, how do you choose between this? They're both movies. Does some people's happiness count more than others? Think about it. If you had a choice and utilitarian ethics said, you need to be impartial, but you could produce happiness for a loved one, or you could produce happiness for a stranger, who are you going to pick? Under this it says, you shouldn't choose. They're still both people. You need to be impartial, but I think most people would sit there and say, I find it very hard to be impartial. This person's happiness counts more to me than someone else's. Consider you've got a small population of people X. They've been enslaved by a larger population of people Y. Utilitarian ethics might say that this is okay because the harm done to X is much smaller than the joy given to Y. Is that okay? So some things you've got to say are just off limits, and whatever you're applying, you need to be rational about it. You need to apply some critical thinking. Consequences also can be hard to foresee. Science fiction is full of tropes of, I saved baby Hitler. In the moment, it seems like a good idea. 30 years down the track, you think, maybe you shouldn't have done that. So how far into the future do you look to understand the consequences of your action? Unless you can time travel, in which case please talk to me afterwards, it can be very hard to know the consequences of your action. All right, so the third framework is contractual ethics. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's what two people agree to do. I agree not to hit Andy because he's falling asleep in my talk. However, if Andy and I were to step into a boxing ring, we might very much agree that we're going to hit one another because that's what you do in a boxing ring. So context matters. The things that were off limits over here might be okay over there. And contractual ethics is all about sitting there saying differences are okay so long as people agree. Now, it's not literally a contract. Every time I meet someone, I don't ask them their series of things that they agree that we can and cannot do and talk to one another about and interact with. That would be crazy. So it's all about having an ideal contract. Now, real contracts suffer due to exploitation, power dynamics. I mean, that's part of the whole reason for the Me Too movement. So when we talk about contractual ethics, we're talking about the best possible contract that could be made between the people who are engaged with us. But then this leads into the same set of problems that we had with utilitarian ethics in measuring the best good outcome. And it requires that everybody participating is rational and are able to make good decisions for themselves and for other people. But at least contractual ethics at least allows for the fact that, you know, what's okay in white Western society might be different to what's okay in feudal Japan, whereas having a universal set of ethics is very hard. However, contractual ethics has evolved kind of mostly separately around the world and is codified in a whole heap of philosophies and religions in all sorts of cultures. Treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself, with kindness, with empathy, with respect. Now, ethics is a system like any other. It comes with some warnings to stop yourself from using it inappropriately, causing damage to yourself and others. If you're busy trying to live an ethical life, it leads to a sense of condescension, paternalism. I know better than you what you need, and I will apply my ethical code to the decisions I make about you. So say you've got a friend and they're busy applying for, they want to get help into going to art school. And you're like, no, you want to go into business school, there's no money to be made in arts, you should go off and do a business degree. So they might choose, in order to make a decision that they think is the best thing for their friend, they might sabotage that art school application and they would justify it under their ethical code. So you need to consider someone else's best interest, not what you think is their best interest, but what they think is their best interest. But, whoa. But then you are at the risk of losing your own autonomy. Does that then mean that you can't think critically and that all you're doing is enabling someone else? If you've got a friend, they've just had a terrible breakup, they're busy drowning their sorrows down at the pub and they say, hey, I can't find my keys, I want to drive home. Should you then, that's clearly what they want to do, should you enable them to do that because that's their request, that's their decision? No. So I found contractual ethics was more of an idea of test. It was if I've made a decision either based on motivation or an outcome, I could apply contractual ethics to decide whether it would minimise harm, which is sort of an inverse of looking at ethics, or whether it would maximise good. Good news. Every form of ethics that I've talked about has got an inbuilt mechanism to spread your ethics like a virus, but a virus for good, not for evil. So virtue ethics says that we want to be good people, we want to model good behaviour, we're going to be good citizens. While we can't teach virtue ethics, by modelling it, we help others to internalise it. We help others to become their best. If you're a utilitarian ethicist, part of creating the greatest possible common good for the greatest possible number of people is surely spreading that idea of producing more of the common good to more people. So that was a lot. If you're like me, ethical theory is a bit like super duper deep and totally outside of my comfort zone. All of this research into ethical theory taught me that it didn't actually matter which one you picked. They all had their flaws. Mostly it came down to be intentional about what you're doing. Does it make sense? Is it going to treat people with respect? Is it going to treat them the way I would like to be treated? Is it going to have a good outcome or a bad outcome? There is no magical solution. There is not the magical list of here is how to be ethical. If there was, war across the surface of planet Earth probably would not have taken place with people having arguments over which belief system was better. But living ethically, as it turns out, is actually quite hard. There's a gap between our ideals of how we think we are and our actual actions. Parents discover this double standard very early on as we tell our children that they should eat more fruit and drink more water, and then when they've gone to bed, we stuff our faces with chocolate and wine. Oh, it turns out that's not just me. Good. So I would say to you, rather than trying to fix the world, which is a very large kind of ask, Walk before you can run. Do you care about the environment? Hopefully. But do you walk past litter on the street? Maybe you could just pick up a piece every so often and put it in the bin. Leave the world a better place. Do you pay for the free and open software that you enjoy? Josh's talk about the open source community highlighted the need to support the free software movement, otherwise it dies and we all lose. We value being paid for our time, but most of us anyway live in Australia, where our ability to access content the moment it's released is heavily constrained. Where do you get your TV and movies from? You value being paid for your creative endeavours. What about the people who are producing that content that we all enjoy consuming? If you're lucky enough to be financially privileged, and if you work in IT, this is often the case, you can choose where you buy, particularly now I've shown you what an ethical company might look like. Perhaps you'd like to just write to a politician over an issue that matters to you, like potentially getting rid of that Victorian law about electronic voting machines that Vanessa spoke about. Politicians are just people. What's the worst that can happen? They'll ignore you. The email goes into the void. That's a pretty low-cost way to just test out the waters. For me, I started by leaving Facebook. Their data protection principles and the things that they were doing with the data that me and my friends were putting up there, I couldn't justify living with anymore. And it meant that I knew that I would lose contact with family and friends through taking this action. But for me, that decision was worth it. I want you to live consciously and start small. All right, but it's still hard. Like, it's one thing to sit there and say, I'm going to be more diligent about sorting my recycling. It's another thing to go along and tell your employer that you think that they're doing a terrible job with your customers' data. Which is why I said you want to start making those small ethical choices in your personal life so that you would understand the kind of resistance that you're going to encounter when you try and ask other people to do the same in an environment that's very capitalistic driven. Living an ethical life can often mean it's more financially expensive. There are plenty of services that you can get that is financially free, although we pay for it in other ways. But if you choose an ethical company, you're often paying with money, and that requires privilege to be able to do so. It can choose losing some features. At Fastmail, we're all about de-Googling our life a lot of the time, and I asked my colleagues, I said, what search engine do you use? And most of them are using Google, and I've chosen to use DuckDuckGo, and I said, why, you've all tried DuckDuckGo, why haven't you moved? And they said, well, Google works better. You can lose features if you're going to go for an ethical option. But also, if you make changes in your personal life before you tackle the big stuff out in the real world, it lets you appreciate how much more comfortable and happier within your own skin you can be. Because your life that you're living is no longer in conflict with your idea of who you are. People can be paid all the money in the world, but if their values don't align, eventually they are going to leave your company or they're going to burn out. You cannot buy out someone's ethical code. I am lucky enough to work for an employer where my values are aligned, and from my statistically significant sample size of 1, I can tell you that it is the best. All right, so say you've practiced in your personal life and you're like, yep, I'm starting to get the hang of this, it's getting easier, or I've got some tools to start having some conversations. Let's tackle the workplace. But you're a single voice, how do you go about making a difference? Now, if you're in a small company, as I mentioned, you have a greater ability to shift that needle. But your company's overall impact can be smaller. You can be constrained by time, money, resources, but smaller companies are often less subject to scrutiny, for better or worse. So what would I say is, when you're looking at your workplace and you're like, I would like to make this place better, start with how you think it should be. What can you directly control? Do you know who your customer is? Is your product respectful of them? If you were a customer, how would you like it to behave? Think outside of yourself and your worldview. Think about minorities. Think about underrepresented people at risk because they've got mental health issues or physical health issues, or maybe they've got a violent spouse. Are they disabled? Do they live in a remote community? Are they financially having problems? Different people use our products in different ways, and we want to make sure that it is open to all. If you're wondering whether your company that you work in is doing good practices, here's another test. Do you have to rationalise to yourself or others what you do? If you're having to rationalise and kind of explain to yourself and others to make them feel comfortable about what you're getting up to, probably there's a bit of a disconnect there. And hopefully you can go in and be an agent for change. Sometimes that's not possible. I did toy with the idea of coming up with a scorecard. What were the values that mattered to me? Rating things on whether I thought it met my criteria. And then maybe I could pick what things I was going to go out and fix next. Didn't come up with a good idea. If you've got one, let me know. Keep saying this, it is hard. It's really hard. And this is why we are in the place where we are today. Our technology is lagging behind our desire. There's a lot of inertia. This is the way it's always been done. You're just a small cog, large machine. What change can you affect? I'll just work on my stuff and then I'll go home, collect my paycheck, go home and pat the cat. We're also trained to be cost sensitive. I'd really like to pay for my email. I know I should pay for my email or I should buy a password manager, but that costs money and really I need another coffee instead. You also won't win. Not every time. You can go out there and you can make that argument and you can see no results of your change, and that can feel very disheartening. Take heart. You're normalising these conversations in the way that the gender binary was very normal even as much as 5 years ago. We are now seeing more and more web forms, including other better options, and some of them are still not best, but at least they're better. So the more conversations you have within an environment that says, hi, have you thought about respecting users in a bit better way? Why are we holding on to this data of theirs forever? Maybe we should put a bit of a cap on that. Your company might still say no, but at least you're normalising the conversation and someone who comes after you. You've loosened the jar a little bit, as I say. All right, so I want to give you some tools for handling the inevitable pushback, because there's going to be resistance. Often people will sit there and say, yeah, well, we'll sort all out privacy, ethics, customer data respect thing in phase 2. You're all in this room. You know that phase 2 really means never. It's always going to fall to the bottom of the priority list. It's our job to lift it back up again. So what do you do to make it easier? You find people who are willing to help. And you can find allies in really unexpected places. Sure, there's hopefully other aware technologists, particularly if they've come to an awesome conference like LCA. User testers. They are a great advocate for the user. They can tell you whether a user thinks that what you're doing is wrong or right. And while we often berate sales and marketing for not understanding what it is that they're selling, any marketer will tell you they would much rather sell a product that is honest and good and true rather than something they have to sneakily kind of do an end run to explain certain behaviours about the product. Go and talk to your marketing people. You will find allies there. You still need choice. And then there is ultimate choice. If you cannot affect change within your organisation, you can take your labour elsewhere. Most of the time. There are plenty of people who don't have that privilege to sit there and say, I will walk away from my job because this is too important to me. Or maybe they can't afford to do it right now. That's okay too. It is our job in those circumstances to give those people the help that they need in order to be able to make those choices. When you're looking around, what does it mean to find a good ethical person? Who do you admire who embodies good traits around you? Can you be that person? You already are that person. There are people. Maybe they're at home, maybe they're in the workplace. They've sat there and said, this person, Joe, Bob, Steve, Marissa, they've come to LCA I really admire what they're doing. Maybe they gave a talk. Maybe they just spoke to some people. I really admire them. You don't know, you're already being a role model for someone else. So make sure that when you're role modelling, that you're modelling the values that you aspire to. Now, all the ethical styles I've spoken about, they're all good. You can pass them on to other people. You can have those conversations. I want you to go out and be a positivity virus. I want you to be the punk hope optimism that we need in this world. I need you to be the llama-corn. All right, what have I covered? I've covered a quick tour of ethical theory and talked about their flaws. I've given you a framework for examining whether an organisation is ethical. We've talked about how if you live ethically in your personal life, you're better equipped to handle those big conversations when you get into your professional life, and about turning it into a habit so that it's not just one good act, but it turns into one good life. I've spoken a little bit about some of the barriers that you might encounter and giving you some ways to navigate around those. But even if you forget everything else from this talk today, I just want you to think of one good thing that you can do in your personal life to live closer to your values. I'm sure you'll be able to find something. Hopefully I've infected you all today with a bit of hope, punk. Go forth, llama-corns. Take up your responsibility to build good tech that's respectful. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Absolutely.
Anyone? Yes.
Immanuel Kant is about as difficult to understand as The Good Place makes it, by the way.
This isn't actually a question, but it's a funny story. In 2010, I was in Sydney and I met somebody, our kids were in kindy together, and she'd actually written to the New South Wales Education Department asking that ethics could be put in as an option for the religion classes. And she had a letter from the New South Wales Education Department saying, "We don't believe in teaching ethics in our schools."
That grieves me, but I hope that she has loosened that metaphorical jar, and if more people continue to ask for it, that one day it'll happen. Good story, thank you. Josh, down the front. No, someone up the back, go.
Figured since you're over here already. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about working on something that itself is maybe just a tool. So we work for an open source product, and it is used by people doing amazing things, but it's also used by some institutions doing some pretty awful things. How do you evaluate something that you can't control at all?
There was a recent incident, actually, of some technology that had been used by some bad organisations, and the sort of curating body, and sorry, I can't remember the details, the curating body says we are cutting off access for this tool to these kinds of organisations. Now we've found out about it, we're cutting off access to the tool. We don't want this technology to be used in this way. So it is possible to have those conversations and hopefully, encourage that kind of change to take place to limit where it goes. I think about Oppenheimer and his bomb. What did he think he was making? Could he have limited the harm? I don't really know. There's no clear answers here. Which is why I'm urging you to find an ethical code that works for you and your values, and that you choose intentionally what you're going to do. So in that situation, you could sit there and say, I'm working on this tool, it's got great benefits, I cannot manage to convince someone to stop using it badly, maybe regretfully I'm going to not use that tool anymore, or work on that tool anymore because the risk of the harm being done is too great. Even if it does benefit all these other ways, maybe there's a better way of building something else that these people could use instead that doesn't expose itself to the bad people.
Thank you. I really appreciated the way you pointed out that ethics as a concept has kind of gender bias and culture bias built into it. And I wondered in your work if you had come across a different term that may invite more diverse perspectives into the conversation rather than the term ethics?
I think, if you look around the conference, people are talking about things that are essentially ethics and giving them other labels because of the shape that it takes. So whether that is talking about legislation, whether that's talking about privacy principles and what does it mean to be private, and can we provide herd immunity to people who are at risk through everybody taking action that would previously be seen as, sort of a defensive kind of mechanism. To me, that's still ethics. It's just kind of ethics in action, if you will. I don't know of another term that kind of, is a sort of synonym for ethics that hasn't got all of these overtones, though. I'd be interested in finding more. Let me know if you figure something out.
One last question.
So sort of building on that last question, knowing that the ethical frameworks that we are most familiar with, that are most baked into our society, come from people with great privilege. In what you have learned and just in your thinking on this subject, is there anything that you've discovered in sort of the philosophy of indigenous peoples, of underrepresented peoples, that you would want us to bring to bear in the way that we decide how we navigate the world? Sorry, it's a little broad, but...
That is awesome. I have not done any research. It is, in part because this is a 45-minute talk, and I didn't even cover all of the large Western philosophical things as it was, and I wanted to give, just dip a toe into the water and provide a framework for things that, we've already internalised to make it easier to build a framework on. I would love to research more. I have a sneaking suspicion, totally unfounded because I have done no research, but I have a sneaking suspicion that those frameworks for underrepresented and minority communities are probably not documented all that well. And, it might be quite hard to get that kind of information out and shared. I imagine that some cultures might feel that is very sort of personal to them, and maybe they're even unwilling to share with outsiders. I don't know. I'd love to research more. I think, we have a lot to learn from getting some more diverse voices and into thinking about what it is to live a good life and to build good technology.
Thank you.
One more round of applause for Nicola.